In June 2024, a story spread across every financial corner of the internet, claiming that the 50-year petrodollar deal between America and Saudi Arabia had finally expired. Thousands of videos and articles announced the dollar was dying, that the arrangement holding the global financial system together was officially finished, and that the moment Henry Kissinger had prevented for 50 years had finally arrived. Almost none of those reports got the actual story right. There was no formal deal with an expiry date. The channels screaming about dollar collapse were working from a myth, but nobody in those thousands of articles stopped to ask what the real arrangement actually was, or what was genuinely happening to it. When you trace what was actually built in 1974 and what is actually coming apart right now, the true story turns out to be more consequential, more precise, and far more strategically significant than anything that went viral. This is what actually happened. This is what is actually happening now. And this is why the version everyone else is telling you misses the entire point. Start in October 1973. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announces an embargo directly targeting the United States and extending restrictions to other countries seen as supporting Israel, including the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. The broader production cuts and resulting price shock hit Europe and Japan as well, rippling through every oil-dependent economy on Earth. Within months, crude oil prices nearly quadruple, rising from roughly $3 to nearly $12 per barrel by January 1974, according to Federal Reserve history data. Long lines of cars stretch around city blocks from Los Angeles to Boston as supply dries up at service stations across the country. The American economy, which had run on cheap and abundant oil for 3 decades, enters a supply crisis it was never built to handle. This is the moment where the post-Bretton Woods petrodollar recycling mechanism actually begins. The dollar reserve currency status already existed before 1974. What this crisis response built was the structural engine that would give it a new anchor after gold convertibility ended 3 years earlier. A crisis response that a small group of men in Washington decided to turn into permanent architecture. President Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger understand something the viral headlines never stop to examine. The United States does not just need to end the embargo. It needs a mechanism that transforms oil, the single most critical commodity on Earth, into a permanent structural advantage for the dollar going forward. Kissinger is tasked with building that mechanism, but what gets built happens in 2 separate meetings, 1 month apart, and that separation matters. In June 1974, Prince Fahd travels to Washington. On June 8th, he and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger announced the United States-Saudi Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, the public framework whose 50th anniversary would later be mistaken for the expiry of a petrodollar contract. But that commission is the visible part. The architecture that actually mattered is built 1 month later, and it is built in secret. 1 month later, in July 1974, Treasury Secretary William Simon boards an early morning flight out of Andrews Air Force Base. The public itinerary is a wider economic diplomacy tour, but the real mission unfolds during a 4-day layover in Jeddah. His counterpart there is not Prince Fahd. It is King Faisal himself. What gets agreed in those sessions is so sensitive that Faisal places one explicit condition on the arrangement. It must be kept strictly secret. That secrecy holds for 41 years, until Bloomberg discloses the Treasury purchasing secrecy in May 2016. America offered 3 concrete things across these 2 rounds of meetings. The first was deep security cooperation covering the Saudi state, including arms sales, military training, and an implicit commitment to Saudi stability. The second was access to American technology and infrastructure development. The third was the bilateral economic cooperation framework announced publicly in Washington with Prince Fahd. What emerged from this alignment was the practice that would define the next 50 years. Oil was priced in U.S. dollars consistently by choice across most of the globally traded oil market. That distinction matters. There was no written requirement. The arrangement held because both sides kept choosing it. What that mechanism produced is documented. By 1977, according to Bloomberg's reporting, Saudi Arabia had accumulated approximately 20% of all U.S. Treasury debt owned by foreign countries. The dollars America paid for Saudi oil were flowing directly back to fund American government borrowing. What Washington engineered across those two tracks was a self-reinforcing engine for American financial power, one that did not require legal enforcement because both sides needed it to keep running. Historian David White, who wrote the definitive academic study of this period in his book Oil Money, has noted that selling oil in dollars is not fundamentally what makes the dollar powerful in global trade. The causality runs the other direction. The power of the dollar in global trade is why most oil gets sold in dollars. The arrangement worked because both sides chose to make it work, and both sides kept choosing that for 50 years. To understand how significant that choice was, consider what the dollar looked like before 1974. The Bretton Woods system, which tied the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce, had collapsed in 1971 when Nixon suspended gold convertibility. At that moment, the dollar was a currency backed by nothing except faith in American institutions. The 1974 arrangement did not create dollar dominance from nothing. It reinforced it at exactly the moment the dollar needed a post-gold mechanism. As dollar invoicing remained the dominant practice across global oil markets, most internationally traded oil became a structural reason for every central bank on Earth to hold dollar reserves. U.S. financial depth, Treasury market liquidity, and institutional credibility all mattered too. But the oil pricing practice and the recycling of surplus dollars back into American bonds added a layer of structural demand that deepened the dollar's position at precisely the moment its old foundation had been removed. Saudi Arabia was the linchpin of that reinforcement. If you are following this kind of analysis, subscribe now. Every video on this channel traces decisions back to their original source instead of describing them at the surface level. This is where the reporting on Saudi Arabia fell apart. In 2022, Saudi Arabia was reported to be in discussions about settling some oil purchases in Chinese yuan, while China publicly urged Gulf states to adopt yuan-based energy trade through the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange. Chinese President Xi Jinping made that push explicit during his visit to Riyadh in December 2022. The discussions unfolded without formal announcement from Riyadh's finance ministry, and the full extent of any actual yuan settlement that followed remained difficult to independently verify. But whatever the yuan discussions produced commercially, they did not restructure the underlying security calculus on their own. What restructured it was what China did in March 2023. Beijing brokered a diplomatic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran after 4 days of previously undisclosed talks in the Chinese capital, restoring relations between two countries that had been regional adversaries for years. The economic implications were secondary. The strategic signal was primary. For 50 years, part of what made the American security relationship valuable to Riyadh was American influence over regional threats, Iran chief among them. The March 2023 deal demonstrated something new, that regional security problems no longer had to run exclusively through Washington. Saudi Arabia did not abandon its American relationship after this, but it had proof that alternatives existed. Because that proof now existed, 2024 brought a revealing structural signal. Saudi Arabia joined mBridge, the cross-border central bank digital currency platform connecting China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates. Enbridge does not include the Federal Reserve as an issuing participant, and it does not include a dollar central bank digital currency. The platform reached a minimum viable product stage in 2024, though the Bank for International Settlements subsequently exited the project, with BIS leadership describing Enbridge as not yet mature enough for full operation. What Saudi Arabia joined was a pilot rail, not a finished system. But joining a pilot is still an important signal about where Riyadh is placing its options. And Riyadh made one further calculation that reporting consistently missed. In August 2023, Saudi Arabia was invited to join BRICS, the emerging market economic bloc actively building financial infrastructure to reduce dollar dependence in international trade. Unlike the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, who accepted the invitation immediately, Saudi Arabia chose a third path. Riyadh neither accepted nor declined, holding the invitation deliberately in reserve. Saudi Economy Minister Faisal al-Ibrahim confirmed as recently as January 2025 that membership is still being assessed. That deliberate hesitation is itself the signal. Saudi Arabia is not committing to any single direction. It is keeping every option live simultaneously, which is a more sophisticated strategic position than simply joining. Set all of those political moves aside for a moment. The financial arithmetic underneath them tells an even starker story. Saudi Arabia's own balance sheet data from 2024 is the most consequential evidence in this entire picture. 50 years ago, the kingdom's current account surplus, the excess dollars it generated from oil exports above what it spent on imports and domestic expenses, represented more than 50% of its gross domestic product. That surplus was the physical raw material for petrodollar recycling. All those excess dollars needed somewhere to go, and the 1974 alignment made sure they went into U.S. Treasury bonds, keeping U.S. borrowing costs lower and the dollar in permanent structural demand. In 2024, IMF data showed Saudi Arabia had moved from a 2.9% current account surplus in 2023 to a 0.5% deficit. Saudi Arabia was no longer running a surplus at all. Financial analysts projecting forward now expect those deficits to widen, reaching approximately 3.4% of gross domestic product by 2030. A country running a current account deficit is no longer generating a large automatic stream of surplus oil dollars to recycle. The mechanism requires new inflows of excess dollars. Those inflows have stopped. So what about June 9, 2024? The date the internet decided the petrodollar deal had expired? The viral story attached itself to the 50th anniversary of the June 1974 Joint Commission. Some fact checks describe that administrative framework as having lapsed in June 2024. Whether or not the legal mechanics of that expiry are precise in every detail matters less than what the archival record shows clearly. That commission never contained a formal requirement to price oil in dollars. As PolitiFact, the Carson Group, Ledger Insights, and historian David White all confirmed, the formal oil for dollars contract the viral story described never existed. The story identified the wrong mechanism. It just happened to get the timing approximately right. Something was ending around 2024. But it was the ERA in which Saudi Arabia had no real alternative to the dollar system, not a contract on a piece of paper. While Saudi Arabia was quietly building all of those alternatives, something else was changing the fundamental arithmetic of the original 1974 arrangement at the same time. The United States became the largest single oil producer in history, pumping 13.6 million barrels per day in 2025, a new annual record according to the Energy Information Administration. American crude oil now competes directly with Saudi oil in global export markets in a way that simply did not exist when those meetings took place in Washington and Jeddah in 1974. Back then, Saudi Arabia held near irreplaceable leverage, America needed their oil and their participation in the dollar pricing system. Today, American production has restructured that calculus on both sides. Washington has more energy flexibility than it has held in half a century. But Riyadh now has more buyers, more payment options, and more strategic alternatives than at any point in its history. The original alignment of interests that made the informal arrangement so stable has been fundamentally changed by the success of American energy development. This is not Saudi Arabia betraying the United States. It is Saudi Arabia calculating exactly the way every rational state calculates when its bargaining position changes. The American-security relationship retains real value. U.S. financial markets remain the deepest and most liquid in the world. But Riyadh is no longer willing to operate as an exclusively dependent partner when genuine alternatives now exist. The yuan settlement discussions, the Enbridge participation, the BRICS invitation left deliberately open, and the Iran normalization brokered by Beijing are not declarations of war on the dollar system. They are insurance policies, purchased quietly, at a pace calibrated not to alarm Washington while still advancing Saudi interests across every direction simultaneously. The dollar is not going to collapse. That framing misunderstands both the architecture and the available alternatives. No single currency or payment system is currently positioned to replace the dollar across the full range of international commerce. BRICS payment ideas remain underdeveloped. Enbridge is early stage. CIPS, China's RMB cross-border clearing system, is operational but serves a fraction of global trade and functions nowhere near the scale needed to displace dollar-based infrastructure. These are not replacement systems. They are foundations being laid while the existing system still runs. What is actually happening is fragmentation. The dollar's share of global central bank reserves has dropped from 72% in 2001 to 56.77% as of the fourth quarter of 2025, according to IMFCOFER data. The mechanism that kept dollar demand structurally guaranteed, the one built across two meetings in Washington and Jeddah in the summer of 1974, is losing its grip on the one commodity that made it necessary. The arrangement that helped reinforce American financial dominance for 50 years was never written down. And it is ending the same way it began, quietly and in private through decisions made behind closed doors where no public announcement will ever be issued. Not a collapse, but a fragmentation. And fragmentation, counterintuitively, is harder to reverse than any single dramatic break would be. There is no moment to point to. There is no signature to tear up. Only a surplus that used to fund a superpower, quietly running dry. If this kind of primary source analysis is what you are after, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every video on this channel is built the same way, with original research, real sourcing, and the actual architecture behind the decisions everyone else is only describing from the outside.